She cut me off mid-slide. Middle of a board meeting, lights low, eyes on the numbers, and Madeline Carr, the new VP of Ops barely 3 weeks into her polished little reign, stood up like she was the second coming of Jobs and waved to security like I was yesterday's garbage. "You're done here," she said. Cold. Performed. Theater for the board. The guards hesitated. Bless them. No one had briefed them this was coming. I didn't flinch, just removed my badge, set it on the table without a word, and met her eyes. "Check your email," I said, then walked out while everyone else sat in stunned silence, blinking like their software had just crashed. Before I even made it to the elevator, my phone buzzed twice. First, the board's credential sync request failed. Then the quorum scanner flagged a security fault tied to a known identity, mine. Clause 917 had activated. They didn't know it yet, but the meeting was already over, because without my credential chain, none of them could legally vote. I didn't leave empty-handed. I left like a match leaves a room. Still quiet, but burning everything behind me. Hey, if you've been listening this far and you're hooked, do me a favor, tap that subscribe button and like the video. It really keeps this team going, and trust me, things are only just getting started. Anyway, let me rewind for a second, because this isn't just about a boardroom tantrum or some petty tech turf war. I built the architecture that held Trenchant Holdings together. 6 years in a thankless role, watching execs change every quarter like socks while I stayed back end, keeping the entire machine stitched together. My job wasn't flashy, no speeches, no team huddles, but every acquisition, every payroll raise, every legal handoff flowed through the digital custodial chain I designed. I didn't want attention, I wanted integrity. My system ensured only people with the right clearance could approve what mattered, and that's exactly what Madeline Carr hated about me. She came in like a wrecking ball in heels, all buzzwords and optimization targets. From day one, it was clear she'd been brought in to chop heads. She'd smile through the cuts, call it modernizing operations, and make the board swoon with charts on how many millions she'd unlock by downsizing legacy systems. But her biggest crime wasn't arrogance. It was ignorance. She didn't understand how deeply embedded some of us were. She thought legacy meant old. What it really meant was foundational. I tried. Honestly, I did. I sat through her lean, agile town halls. I answered every question from her cleanup crew, consultants who couldn't tell a permissions grid from a Google form. They wanted to replace our nested credential layers with open tokens and pooled access. Faster approval flow, they said. Reduced friction, they said. I flagged the risks. Repeatedly. Everything from security regressions to potential SEC exposure on M&A flows. Silence. Or worse. Polite nods followed by nothing. One contractor actually told me, "You're too cautious. We're building for scale, not for comfort." Comfort? I wasn't trying to make things cozy. I was trying to prevent a multi-million-dollar compliance breach that could sink the firm. Then came the meeting. I'd been invited to present a 5-slide risk assessment. Tightly rehearsed, no fluff, just the facts. And 2 minutes in, before I even got to the chart, showing 5 blocked escalation paths due to token conflicts, she stood up and said it. "You're done here." Just like that. No warning, no context, just a public execution for the room to witness. What she didn't know was that firing me wasn't like cutting a loose thread. It was like yanking out a keystone. Clause 917 wasn't just a footnote in a contract. It was a living part of the infrastructure, buried inside our authentication firmware. It meant that anyone holding executive-level custodial clearance couldn't be removed without a full board vote, not suspended, not escorted out, not terminated, especially not during an active sync window, which just so happened to be that day, that hour, that meeting. She had tripped the wire without realizing it. And when that badge hit the table, it wasn't just symbolic, it was the trigger. They came in like termites with MBAs, clipboard warriors from some consultancy I'd never heard of, wearing matching blazers and fake enthusiasm. Madeline called them her lean, agile cleanup crew, as if my system was a hoarder's garage and not the spine of a $3.2 billion organization. They didn't even try to understand the logic trees or flow dependencies. They just pointed at diagrams and said things like streamline, flatten, reduce approval latency. What they really meant was destroy accountability and let anyone with a pulse push through million-dollar approvals with a single click. Their solution? Replace all layered credential checks with shared admin pools and unsecured tokens. Tokens that couldn't verify origin chains. Tokens that wouldn't flag escalation mismatches. Tokens that had no business near anything even remotely compliance-bound. My alert dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree wrapped in C4. Escalation warnings, sync errors, ghost approvals with no origin trace. I filed internal reports. Nothing. I flagged them directly to her inbox. Radio silence. Then came the alignment meeting. No agenda, just Madeline, crossing one leg over the other like this was a courtroom drama and she was about to deliver a closing argument. "We're pivoting to a more agile model," she said, with that rehearsed smile. "Your system, while stable, isn't future-facing. It's not optimized for flexibility or scalability. Honestly, it feels territorial. Territorial." That was rich. I kept my face neutral. "You're replacing credential barriers with unsecured keys. That's not agile. That's an open barn door." She tilted her head, faux curious. "You're resisting progress." That's a red flag. I could have told her right then. Could have laid it all out. The buried protocol, the board approval I got 3 years ago to embed an override layer in the firmware, tied to my credentials and ratified under compliance restructuring. I could have reminded her that even if she fired me, the system wouldn't let go, not without tripping alarms in places her little crew didn't even know existed. But I didn't, because I needed her to keep walking toward the minefield. Clause 917 wasn't something you waved around. It was something you detonated only when your name was already on the severance paperwork and your badge had been scanned for the last time. And most importantly, it was only effective if no one tried to interfere before it triggered. So I sat there, nodded slowly, and said, "Understood." From that moment on, it wasn't about preventing anything. It was about documenting everything. Every credential reassignment they tried to push through without proper escalation. Every proxy approval request that came from an unsecured token. Every time a shared admin login was used to bypass a locked M&A review. My system didn't stop them. It absorbed, logged, flagged, archived, like 1,000 tiny threads tightening by the hour. You can ignore a risk analyst. You can fire a systems architect. But the code doesn't care about your job title, and neither did Clause 917. Madeline never once asked why certain systems still required my signature, even after they'd restructured the chain. Never noticed the faint gray lock icon on the board voting terminal. Never questioned why the architecture log still showed me as the root for approval lineage. Because when you're convinced you're the smartest person in the room, you stop looking for who built the room. She didn't see the storm coming, and I didn't warn her. It was the quarterly board session. Big table, bigger egos. One of those meetings where half the room pretends to read reports while the other half wonders who's next to be reorganized. I had 5 slides. That's all. 5 simple, terrifying slides that showed just how badly the new access policies were compromising our audit trail. Tightly rehearsed. I'd spent 3 nights fine-tuning the escalation map so even the chair of the compensation committee could follow it. I knew my timing, my pauses, even which slide would make the CFO's eyelid twitch. I'd done this before, dozens of times. But this time, Madeline was watching me like a hunter staring down a deer that didn't know it had already been shot. I should have seen it coming. I clicked to slide 3. It showed 3 approval chains that had flatlined after her team introduced pooled tokens, access pathways that, before her, required 5-level credential flow and now let a junior analyst push through vendor payments without a single executive gate. It wasn't speculation, it was in the logs. Her logs. That's when she stood. Smooth, confident, like she was about to give a TED talk on corporate disruption. "We appreciate the legacy context," she said, fake warmth laced through every syllable, "but we won't be continuing this presentation." I blinked. "I'm not done." She didn't even look at me, just turned to the guards flanking the door, 2 guys from facilities I knew by name. "She's done here. Escort her out." The entire room tensed like someone had just sneezed in a courtroom. The GC looked up, confused. One board member lowered his glasses, but no one spoke. That's the kind of power a VP of Ops thinks she has on her first real test drive. I didn't argue, didn't protest. I just reached up, unclipped my badge from my lanyard, and walked toward the table. Madeline looked amused, like I was about to toss it in some grand, childish act of defiance. Instead, I set it down gently, directly in front of her. Deliberate, silent. "Check your email," I said. Then I turned to the rest of the room. "The board reconvenes in 90 minutes. And walked out. 2 minutes later, while I stood in the elevator watching the floor numbers flick by like nothing had happened, the system registered the badge drop. Clause 917 activated, protocol sync triggered, and every voting terminal in that boardroom went dark. Not even Madeline knew yet, but she would. Because in her rush to erase me, she triggered something no one in that room had seen in years. Something written, approved, and buried in the very bones of the firm. A rule that was meant to protect the board from exactly what she had just attempted. An unsanctioned termination of a credential custodian without vote, warning, or compliance override. I'd built it years ago, back when they asked me to re-architect the chain of custody for executive approvals after a previous VP had tried to greenlight an acquisition without full vetting. I never removed the clause, never got around to it. Or maybe I always knew someone like her would come around again. By the time the elevator doors opened in the lobby, the alert had already hit legal. And by the time she finished her little victory lap in the boardroom, she'd realized she'd just yanked the wrong thread, and the whole suit was unraveling. The wind hit me the second I stepped through the glass doors. Cool, sharp, indifferent, like the building itself had exhaled now that the dead weight was gone. I paused at the edge of the plaza, eyes scanning nothing in particular but in my head. I was already watching the cascade begin, not in theory, not in metaphor, in code, in live protocol threads tripping like dominoes stacked by a very patient hand. Because that badge I left on the table, it wasn't just ID, it was the keystone. Clause 917, board lock protocol, had been dormant for almost 4 years, not broken, not deprecated. Just sitting quietly beneath the new systems, like bedrock under a luxury condo nobody remembers is built on a fault line. The moment my badge logged its final state, terminated without credential chain clearance, the protocol went active, instantly. First, quorum lockout. You see, my credential lineage didn't just authenticate basic access, it verified voting rights, proxy routing, legal handoff for M&A resolutions. 5 systems tied directly to my chain, all of which were required for any valid board action to proceed. When you pull that without triggering the right release flow, the system assumes a breach. And when the system thinks it's under attack, everything freezes. Board portal locked. Voting terminals blinking error screens. Quorum validation null. And the best part? It wasn't just a tech freeze, it was a legal one. The systems weren't just broken, they were in violation. Clause 917 wasn't some IT protocol, it was a ratified compliance structure. Written, approved, signed. And every single member of that board had voted for it during the post-Brenner audit cleanup, back when they swore they'd never again let unchecked executive action slide through without oversight. Madeline hadn't just tripped a wire, she'd violated a standing compliance clause in full view of the board. She thought I was bluffing when I told her to check her email. I wasn't, because waiting in her inbox, time-stamped 15 minutes before that boardroom ambush, was a signed, notarized alert from my advisory firm Northgate Systems. Subject line, Activation Notice, Clause 917 Custodian Override. It explained in legal terms that any attempt to remove my credentials without a majority board vote would trigger a full systems lock and escalate to internal legal review. It cited the clause, quoted the backup signatories, attached the architecture diagram she never bothered to read. The moment that badge left my hand, that email became law. The GC would see it first, then the chairman. Then the platform itself would chime in, one by one, with errors no one in the room could fix because the person who wrote the system was now standing in front of a food truck 2 blocks away, calmly ordering a black coffee with an extra shot of espresso. I sipped it while checking my phone. System status, lockout condition triggered, protocol lineage active, custodian, override chain protected. Madeline could scream at the IT lead all she wanted, call the CTO, threaten legal. It wouldn't matter. None of them had root access. None of them could override what was hardwired years ago during a period of chaos they barely remembered, but I never forgot. Back then, I told the board they needed insurance. Turns out, I was the policy, and she just tried to cancel it without reading the fine print. The audit logs went red within 4 minutes. Not pink, not orange. Red. Full fail. Authorization servers screaming null response after null response, like every action Madeline attempted was being met with a silent middle finger from a machine that suddenly remembered who it answered to and who it didn't. She tried to log back in after that stunt in the boardroom, tried to clear access logs, reroute credentials, maybe undo what she didn't fully understand. But the system knew she no longer had the clearance to execute those changes. Her profile had already been flagged as potential threat actor under the internal escalation matrix. That wasn't personal. That was code. Code I wrote after the last breach scare when a rogue exec pushed an acquisition deal without legal sign-off. Back then, the board asked me, can we build in a dead man switch for the high-risk roles? I did one better. I built a lineage-aware firewall, and I buried clause 917 inside it like a landmine with facial recognition. Once the badge was dropped, the system treated Madeline's profile as unverified. It stripped her access tier by tier, first board review, then voting proxy control, then escalated clearance for M&A activity. The last to go was her quorum initiation key, which meant the next board session couldn't start. No quorum, no votes, no motion logs, nothing. The ops contractor, some overconfident guy named Bryce who wore loafers with no socks and called everything legacy spaghetti, tried to backdoor the permissions file. Probably thought he'd patch over the freeze with a permissions override script. Cute. Unfortunately for him, that file lived inside firmware. Not on a cloud drive, not on a dashboard. In firmware. And guess what? You can't patch what you can't find. Especially when the file name isn't override.ini, but instead a hashed directory pointer labeled with a fragment from an internal Northgate ethics protocol. There were maybe 4 people on Earth who could trace that file chain. 2 were retired, 1 was me, and the last one, he'd left after the first reorg and now taught system architecture at a community college in Montana. Bryce gave up after the 3rd access denied and called legal. They were already on it, because the board's emergency ping system, the one they only used when a director was incapacitated mid-meeting or a whistleblower flag hit the upper threshold, was going wild. Everything funneled to the general counsel's office, and sitting at the top of that pile was my Northgate memo, time-stamped, digitally notarized, embedded with traceable system logs and an executive compliance signature from the 2020 board session, long before Madeline ever had a badge. And here's the twist, no one remembered except me. That 2020 approval, it wasn't tied to me personally. It was tied to the custodian role, which meant it persisted no matter where I worked. That badge I dropped, it was still bound to the role. The clause didn't deactivate with termination. It only expired when lineage was formally transferred and ratified by vote, which of course had never happened, because they never thought someone like me would need protection from someone like her. Panic set in fast, not the loud kind, not yelling, but the dangerous kind, the whispered phone calls behind closed doors, the pacing outside conference rooms, the sudden disappearance of Madeline from the executive Slack channel. The echo of her mistake wasn't just loud, it was systemic. It pulsed through every approval chain, every voting record, every contractor account that now sat frozen behind gates they didn't have the keys to. And the only person who remembered where those keys were was already logged into a separate terminal at Northgate Systems, sipping coffee, calmly watching the pings roll in. They built a house and forgot who designed the locks. She tried to change the blueprint without asking for the master key, and now the whole damn building was sealed shut. The board reconvened at 11:30, or, well, tried to. They'd cleared the room, scrubbed the guest list. No assistants, no observers, just the inner circle and legal. Phones silenced. Madeline was still there, standing at the head of the table like nothing had happened. Someone had even refreshed her nameplate, VP Operations, centered and smug. But the quorum scanner didn't care about nameplates. The moment the chair tapped the console to open the session, it chirped once, then blinked a message no one in that room had ever seen before. Authorization error, origin chain invalid, quorum verification failed. The terminals didn't respond. The board couldn't vote. Legal stared, confused, like they'd walked into a courtroom and the judge had forgotten how gavels worked. A tech aide tried rebooting the scanner, same error. They attempted to start a proxy script manually, error again. Every path they tried to take looped back to the same fault, origin invalid. The system couldn't establish quorum because one of the primary credential chains, mine, had been severed outside of protocol. And Clause 917 doesn't forgive shortcuts. Madeline didn't speak. Not at first. Just stood there, watching her credibility dissolve screen by screen. Someone passed her a printed copy of the clause. She read the first line. then the second. By the third, her face had gone still. Clause 917. In the event of unsanctioned termination of a credential custodian, all executive authorization pathways shall be suspended pending review by the Internal Oversight Committee. Reactivation requires quorum validation initiated by the originating custodian or a two-thirds override vote, neither of which she could trigger. The committee she just tried to outmaneuver was now being notified that the board's entire voting apparatus had been compromised by her. Because while she had been staging my removal, I'd already sent a memo. Northgate Systems had filed it that morning. Predated, time-locked, and loaded into the compliance sync queue. It outlined everything. The clause, the embedded safeguards, the lineage dependencies. It referenced the board's own 2020 vote approving the Custodian Continuity Act, citing the exact language that classified my removal without due process as a breach event. It didn't accuse her. It didn't need to. It simply stated that a protected termination had occurred, that systems had responded accordingly, and that per contract, the Internal Oversight Committee had been activated to investigate potential violations of operational integrity. That committee includes 2 board members, 1 external legal advisor, and a compliance liaison from, coincidentally, Northgate Systems. Their investigation would be immediate. Madeline reportedly tried to push forward anyway. She suggested pausing the session until technical issues are resolved. But it was too late for that. The chair asked a simple question. Did you review Clause 917 before requesting termination? She didn't answer, because answering would mean admitting she never checked for protocol, never paused to ask if the system had teeth. And in that moment, the illusion cracked. The confident disruptor, the poised operator, the woman with a folder full of buzzwords and a hunger for streamlining, stood exposed as someone who didn't do her homework. The meeting adjourned without ever officially starting. No votes were cast, no notes were logged. The minutes simply read, "Session postponed, authorization fault, pending compliance review." And while they sat in silence, parsing legal fallout and tracing log history, I sat in my office at Northgate with one screen open. System status dashboard. A slow scroll of red boxes shifting back to gray as the lockdown held. You don't have to raise your voice when the system speaks for you. You just have to make sure you built it to remember. By Friday, the smiles were gone. No more LinkedIn posts about trailblazing operational transformation or photos of Madeline standing in front of glass walls with buzzwords behind her. No bold takes in meetings, no breakfast invites from the CFO, just silence. Thick, uncomfortable, and full of lawyers. Word had leaked by then, not to the press. Trenchant was too good at keeping blood off the walls, but inside the firm, the story spread faster than wildfire. The new VP had triggered a board lock. Legal was furious. Compliance was on edge. The Internal Oversight Committee was combing through every access event like it was a crime scene. And it was. Just not in the way Madeline thought. Her mistake wasn't ambition. It was forgetting that power, real power, is never loud. It's written, filed, time-stamped, ratified in rooms without windows, signed by people who never raise their voices. She didn't just break protocol. She broke the clause designed to catch people like her. By Thursday afternoon, she was advised to consider a voluntary exit, to preserve confidence, they said. That's corporate speak for, if you don't leave on your own, you're going to leave in pieces. But resignation wasn't enough. Not this time. Clause 917 was more than a warning. It was a legally bound enforcement article tied to executive contracts and board voting mechanisms. And a breach? That carried a fee, one I'd calculated years ago based on risk exposure, downtime projections, and legal positioning. $4.2 million. Through Northgate, we offered remediation, unlock the systems, restore quorum, reinstate full operational sync across executive voting lines. I could do it in under 2 hours, but only after payment was made. There was no debate, no negotiation, just a signed wire confirmation, routed through a quiet holding entity tied to compliance reimbursements. It cleared before noon Friday. No one mentioned my name. The board released a single sentence in the next internal bulletin. Credential custodian termination improperly executed. Systems restored under approved remediation terms. No apology, no retraction, just confirmation that I'd been right. That I'd built something they didn't understand and needed anyway. Madeline? She vanished. No farewell email, no closing speech. Her name was gone from the executive directory by end of day. I doubt even her laptop made it out of the building. That's how these things go. One day you're standing at the head of the table, pointing fingers like you're untouchable, and the next, it's reimagining your login as a cautionary tale. I didn't ask for a seat back, didn't request a title, didn't walk through the door with a smirk. I didn't have to. They already knew where I stood, because they were standing on it. The difference now? They finally looked down. The boardroom looked the same, high glass, polished walnut, the same underpowered speaker system that always made remote calls sound like they were coming from the bottom of a fish tank. But there was one difference, one glaring, silent void. Her chair. Still there, still leather, still gleaming under the soft recessed light, but empty. No nameplate, no poured water, just the ghost of her ambition and a perfectly folded agenda packet that no one bothered to remove. I didn't sit. They'd reissued my badge that morning, delivered in a sealed envelope to the Northgate Systems office with a short note. Credential advisor, systems oversight, observer status. No title, no team, just access. Persistent, executive-level access to quorum syncs, voting resolutions, escalation logs. I didn't even need to log into the main board terminal. My terminal was separate, quiet, routed through the same clearance lineage she tried to sever and failed. That was the point. Not reinstatement. Recognition. They hadn't invited me to contribute, just to observe, to sit along the wall while they recalibrated. It was their way of saying, without ever saying it, we know, we saw, we remember. I watched the meeting unfold like a systems log in motion, resolutions introduced, motions passed, credentials confirmed with a ping. My screen lit green with each vote as the quorum chain threaded cleanly through my restored access. It wasn't about power, it was about presence. Every vote they cast had to pass through the same lineage she tried to erase. Every confirmation beep was another reminder that the foundation still held, and they knew who built it. No one acknowledged the chair's emptiness, but they all saw it. One director hesitated slightly before casting her vote. Another glanced at the corner where Madeline used to perch her tablet. Small tells, the kind you don't notice unless you're not meant to be noticed. That was the beauty of observer status. You weren't part of the conversation, but you were always in the room. I didn't need applause. I didn't need the board to thank me. The system worked. The clause held. The firm survived its own oversight because someone once thought far enough ahead to write protection into the roots, and now that protection had a name. Credential advisor, Northgate Systems. Nothing flashy. Just a title built like my code. Minimal, unbreakable, intentional. I leaned back, silent, watching the resolutions scroll by. Every vote was clean, every motion passed, every approval still had to pass through me. And the chair? It stayed empty. It's always quiet when it comes in. Just a single blink on the Northgate console, no chime, no alert, a credential sync initiated, another quarterly board prep underway. The system calls for validation, reaching out like it always has, tracing its lineage back to the source. And every time it finds me, a ping, my chain, still intact. It's been over a year since the day I set my badge on that table. Since the clause I wrote moved from obscure legal scaffolding to the keystone that held the entire voting apparatus upright. And in all that time, after the audits, the resignation, the reorgs, the consultant rewrites, no one's touched the architecture. They could, I know that. The board could commission a full rebuild, strip the old lineage, burn the protocol stack down to the studs, but they haven't. Because under all the bluster and transformation initiatives, there's an unspoken understanding. Someone once saved them from themselves. Quietly, surgically, without ego or drama. Just a signature, a clause, a system that didn't flinch when pushed. And now, every 90 days, that same system checks in. Not for me personally, but for the chain, for the logic, for the root credential it trusts not because of status, but because of design. Sometimes I wonder if they even remember why it works the way it does. If the newer board members know what custodian chain validation even means, or if to them, it's just another screen to click through, a formality. a green check mark that quietly lets the meeting proceed. But I remember building that logic when no one asked me to, embedding those clauses when no one thanked me, writing the safeguards not because I wanted credit, but because I couldn't trust that the next bright-eyed disruptor wouldn't trade security for speed and call it innovation. The thing about infrastructure, real infrastructure, is that when it's done right, it fades into the background. Invisible, reliable, untouched, like me. I don't go into the office much anymore. Northgate's comfortable, advisory work is steady. I consult here and there, usually when someone needs to untangle a system that's failing in ways they can't articulate. But every time that quarterly ping hits, I stop, just for a second, to see that the chain still holds, that the decisions still flow through the same path Madeline tried to erase, and that somewhere, deep in the heart of a billion-dollar firm, my imprint endures, not in titles, not in speeches, but in structure. One blink, one credential, permanent.